When we last saw Captain Benton and his 3 companies, they had finished their scout and were approaching the main trail along Reno Creek, which was over a mile to the east of the pack train. He stopped in the area known as the Morass, which is 1/4 to a half mile down the creek, to rest the men and water the horses. We have already stumbled into our first scandal, where Benton's critics will say that he bullied the Morass and spent important time. Reasonable estimates place Benton's leadership at the Morass for 15 to 20 minutes. What do you think? Kindly use the comments box below to express your opinions regarding Benton's performance. During the halt, Captain Weir, who was in charge of D Company, which had led the advance, became agitated and gave Lieutenant Godfrey, who was in charge of K Company, instructions to go to Benton and implore him to leave. The note is handed to his company leaders, but they say nothing. "Where is General Custer?" Benton then said. "To Martin." According to the replies, the camp was roughly 3 miles away and Major Reno was charging it. Benton thought that he could only be fast or bring packs, and that the two were mutually exclusive. He added, "I think I had better not wait for the packs if I'm going to be of service to him," after making up his mind. Then he gave Martin the order to go back to the pack train and tell Captain McDougal to transfer the packs as fast as possible. He said, "Here we have the horns of a dilemma," as he continued to trot downstream until he stopped where Reno and Custer had previously divided. After a quick discussion, Benton and the company commanders decided that we would head left toward the river, and the rest of the command would head right. As they rode on, they could see multiple individuals battling in the valley and on the rocks up ahead. But who was it? Custer? Reno? The Indians? These sightings led to the directive to charge forward with Benton in front, and it was at that moment that he came across a Major Marcus Reno who was almost agitated. "Hold your order and help me, Benton, for heaven's sake," Reno screamed. "I have lost half of my soldiers. We are whipped." Reno was unaware of Custer's location, but Benton showed him Cook's note. "Let's meet with Benton as soon as possible," because he ought to have advised Reno at this point. But since his soldiers needed more ammunition, Reno asked that they hold off until the pack train arrived. Reno, the superior officer in that sector and on the field, had so blocked any move to quickly offer Custer support. As an officer would in a defensive situation, Benton, who was then under Reno's command, gave Weir and Godfrey the order to form skirmish lines. As the few remaining soldiers of Reno's Valley force reached the bluffs, the army could see that the majority of the warriors were moving downstream. Meanwhile, other villagers remained behind to kill and dismember those who were unable to escape during the retreat. Sounds that might have been volleys came from downstream shortly after. "Hear that, Jesus Christ?" Lieutenant Varnum asked Lieutenant Wallace. And that? Even half-dead Lieutenant Godfrey reported hearing a lot of gunfire. After that, he does something that is unforgivable. Instead of gaining positive control, he and about a dozen troops went back to the bluffs and found his aide, Lieutenant Hodgson, dead. After an approximately 30-minute drive, Reno found the corpse, collected some personal items, and went back to the command, which had been inactive the whole time. Regardless, upon his return, Reno appointed Lieutenant Hare as his adjutant and instructed him to promptly return and shift the bags. On the skirmish line, Captain Weir was beginning to feel uneasy, since the intense, constant fire from downstream was gradually decreasing. Weir asked his subordinates, Lieutenant Edgerly and the First Sergeant Michael Martin, who was originally from Dublin, Ireland, if they would be prepared to ride forward even if other companies would not. Both subordinates concurred, so Weir spoke with the just-arrived Reno. After a brief argument with Reno, who incidentally hated the two guys, Weir rode off by himself north along the bluffs. Presuming he had permission, Edgerly mounted D Company and followed Weir out. When he reached the top of the hill that bears his name, Captain Weir put D Company in a skirmish line. Looking off into the distance, Weir added, "That's Custer over there." One of his sergeants, Irish-American Civil War veteran James Flanagan, replied, "Here, Captain. Look through the glasses, please. I think those are Indians." Captain Bentine thinks an order to advance has been given when D Company departs. As a result, he directs businesses H, K, and M to also rise and move north. At this moment, Captain McDougal and Lieutenant create a new skirmish line. In the pack train, Matthew. Reno should have recognized the problem and resolved it. At last, Reno acts upon the arrival of the pack train. He first sends Lieutenant Hare to Weir with a message so that Custer can hear from him. Second, Benedictine moved his troops to Weir Point after ignoring the trumpeter's signal to stop. Reno ordered the wounded, packs, and surviving soldiers to disperse after Bentine failed to respond. To enable them to move independently, a team of 6 soldiers wrapped the 2 wounded people in a blanket. From Weir Point, the defending forces could see hundreds of fighters coming their way. Because he dislikes the defensive posture, Bentine convinces Reno to circle around and return to the position they just left while riding back to him. Weir rode back to join Reno and Bentine, while Bentine swiftly went south, leaving the 2 French companies unprotected and without orders. Soon after, the nervous soldiers from companies D and M engaged in combat with the combatants. When McDougal saw that things were becoming out of control, he approached Bentine and asked, "Hey, old man, what's gonna happen unless we have a commanding officer here pretty damn soon? Since you are the senior captain, we want you to be the one to take the initiative." Bentine just smiled, but from that moment on, he led this final defense. You may say that he saved the rest of the 7th Cavalry from being decimated later that day and the next day, despite a few mistakes. The warriors pursued French and Edgerly as they fled south on horseback after realizing they had been abandoned. One trooper, Vincent Charlie, who was born in Switzerland, was shot from his horse, abandoned by the leadership, and executed by having a broken guide on a shaft or a wooden stick forced down his throat. Lieutenant Godfrey, the commander of Company K, now had the chance to mount a heroic rearguard assault. He had successfully led his men in the Yellowstone campaign and achieved this at the Wachita, despite the fact that he was perceived by many as unmotivated and unmilitary. After observing the 2 companies rushing past him in disorder, Godfrey dismounted his soldiers, ordered Lieutenant Hare, and sent the number 4s with the horses back to the remainder of the command. The unit, which consisted of just around 30 soldiers, was split up into 2 platoons and alternated between firing and retaliating. Under the fierce pressure and firepower of the warriors, the soldiers began to gather together, and only the threats of Godfrey and Lieutenant Hare could keep the peace. Without any casualties, the leadership eventually rushed the final 100 yards into the relative safety of the 7th's defensive perimeter. Their bravery and leadership allowed the rest of the command to somewhat sort itself out. Lieutenant Hare proved to be exactly what he had claimed to be earlier in the day: a warrior and a bitch from Texas. Walking the grounds of the Reno-Bentine defensive site makes it clear that it is not the best place to defend. The soldiers and villagers used saddles, dead animals, grain bags, or anything else they could find as cover. fighting resumed at dawn. In order to hide their activities, the locals burned the grass next to the river as the conflict came to an end in the late afternoon of the 26th. As the afternoon dragged on, the soldiers could watch in wonder as the towns marched upstream along the Little Bighorn. That nightfall, the command watered their horses, made a few quick statements from the administration, and reconnected with some of their countrymen, such as Lieutenant DeRubio, who had been hiding in the timber since the disastrous Reno's charge. Let me start by extending a warm welcome to Antietam. Burnside's bridge is behind me. We'll also be down to the last 2 or 3 episodes of Sioux War. We'll go back to George Crook, who happened to be in charge of a brigade that tried to take the bridge, as a preview. There was also Brigadier General Samuel Sturgis, and we'll be going back to Sturgis in those last few episodes. We'll talk about a controversial commander as well. Then let me look at my notes. Please excuse me while I complete this. All right, this commander, once again disputed, was a highly decorated Civil War general. The U.S. president and this officer argued in public. Another president, Teddy Roosevelt, called him a brave peacock. In addition, that was obviously not a loving term. What else? He was described by his critics as pompous, haughty, and dogmatic. One historian claims that because of his extremely unattractive appearance, a sizable portion of the officer corps detested him. Of course, I'm referring to Nelson Miles, but you knew that too. Gibbon and General Terry crossed the Yellowstone on the afternoon of June 24th. It comprised roughly 400 men from 4 cavalry and 5 infantry companies, the Gatling gun unit, and the few remaining Crow Scouts. They stopped near Tulloch's Creek, where a cavalry unit searched for signs of the Indians or George Herendeen. Herendean's mission was discussed in the first episode. Because its guide was unfamiliar with the area, the column went slowly southward the next day, and just before midnight on the 26th, the command, for whatever reason, halted 1.5 miles north of where the Bighorn and Little Bighorn rivers converge. That was their day's objective. The next morning, the 27th, the leadership ran into 3 of Custer's Crow Scouts. The white man, Harry Moccasin, runs him over and goes on. They describe how, after the bulk of Custer's command was annihilated, only a small force was left. General Terry retorted, "After hearing this, I find it hard to believe that such a fine regiment as the 7th Cavalry should have met with such a